Welcome to the Classroom Podcast, the book club discussion on the classic political philosophy. My name is Eric Nganyange. I'm your host and the student in this class, sitting here with the one and only Professor Ron Klein. Professor?
Eric?
How are you?
I'm semi-conscious already, so It looks like a good day's in the making. And how about you?
I'm great, man. I'm good. I'm read about this guy named Crito.
Yeah, interesting fellow, interesting
Conversation.
situation.
Yeah.
And conversation, exactly so.
So this conversation happened in a prison that Socrates was sent to. When the people are in prison, they're allowed to have visitation, and friends and family members are coming in to visit. And one of those guys who came to see Socrates a couple of times sounds like his old friend by the name of Crito. Seems like he's a businessman, actually successful businessman, and longtime friend of Socrates. He had a different agenda in going and visit his friend. He wanted to help Socrates to escape prison, basically, go live somewhere else away from Athens.
Right.
And he had this thing all planned out. He had people lined up in different cities. He had money to support Socrates and all that. So his only problem was to convince Socrates to escape.
Yeah.
That's when things got a little bit tricky
Yeah.
on getting Socrates out of prison. Basically, he did not want to do it.
Yeah, that's a shocking thing to hear him say. And his response when Crito tendered this offer to him was, Crito, for all our lives we've been talking about different things because they were friends, probably boyhood friends, because they grew up in the same part of the city. And Socrates reminded him that I like to think over things before I decide whether I'm going to do them or not. So why don't we sit here and talk about it for a while? And Crito must have been shocked.
Do you think he was shocked? He kind of expected this probably might not go smoothly.
It's hard to tell from his reaction the way Plato describes it. But I would have thought he would be extremely shocked. He doesn't give any sign of panic or shock in the way he speaks with Socrates, so maybe not.
One of the lines that Socrates said I thought was kind of interesting. He is telling Crito, it's like, we must examine next whether it is just for me to try to get out of here when the Athenians have not acquitted me. If it is seen to be just, we will try to do so. If it is not, we will abandon the idea.
Yep, we're going to have a discussion about this. And your job, Crito, is to convince me that this is a just thing for me to do. And I'll argue it out with you, and then we'll decide what we're going to do.
He was not afraid to die.
No, definitely not. He referenced that, you remember, in his trial. Basically, or at least one of his reasons was, why be afraid of something that you don't even know anything about? So nobody can tell you whether you're going to end up in Hades or just have your flame flicker out completely.
He said the most important thing is not life, but it's good life.
Yeah, he makes that argument to Crito, right? That's one of his premises. You should think about that, though. It's hard to live a good life if you're not alive. So he can't argue that he's going to have a good life necessarily. Might have after he dies. And Crito's saying, well, those two things come in order. You got to be alive first, then we can work on a good life. You really ought to take my offer.
Also, you can argue death is not the greatest loss. It's what died inside you while you're still living is probably the greatest loss.
I would think so.
That would probably be the biggest argument for him.
Well, that would be a different argument than what he presented. He doesn't, as I recall, in any part of this dialogue, make an argument like that.
Yeah.
that I'm killing something inside me if I flee the jail. And so he's making, for the most part, a very practical argument because Crito's making practical arguments. You know, you got kids. He had 3 children.
Oh, boy, he let him have on that one.
He did. And you know he's got a point.
Yeah.
And at his age, it's kind of surprising that he had 3 children. I think the youngest was 6, and the oldest hadn't become old enough to be considered to be a member of the Army. So maybe 16, 17. So you got 3 kids, you got a wife.
Yeah, and that didn't work as much as Crito tried to use that as the guilt.
Well, he also tried to use, and you know, if we don't do this, people in town are going to look down upon us, your friends, for not helping you out, right? So they're going to make our reputation in the city decline. You're going to abandon your children and your wife, and he doesn't say it, but he could have said, and your city. So Crito could argue, well, keeping you alive, even though you won't be in Athens, because if he stays in Athens, they'll just grab him again. You can make some contributions to any city you're in, and you're depriving that city, which would become your home city, of what you do have to offer. Crito's actually putting forward pretty good arguments to convince Socrates to leave.
If we actually did leave, do you think it would be tough for him to make the argument of just and injustice? I mean, basically, the idea of escape the prison was unjust.
I believe he could, and we got to talk about that argument because the central argument is about justice and injustice, and that comes about when Socrates sort of creates a persona for the laws of Athens. He's going to take both sides of the discussion. He's going to be Socrates, but he's going to play the laws of Athens and have a conversation.
I thought that was interesting.
It's absolutely fascinating. But the question is it a good argument? So we got to plow through that. Socrates, speaking for the laws, says, well, you know, Socrates, it's only because of our laws that you were able to be born here, because we licensed the marriage between your parents, that you got an education. We established an educational system. They had, I'm not sure exactly how many years, but they actually had a formal state educational system, shorter in years than stuff we do. You know, we've provided you with a way to make a living and all of these things. In recompense for that, you should consider us even more important than your parents. Now, that's an interesting statement because the laws say all that you have become, we did.
We did that.
You didn't do it. Now, let's look at that for a while. So, can Athens, the laws, say, we made it possible for you to be born? That's a stretch. Right? Now, yes, they could license a marriage, but you could have been born anyway.
With the marriage or not.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right? So how about your education? Well, it's true. We established this education, but it was already there when you were born. You didn't do it specially for me. It was there, so I went.
Yeah.
Right?
But would you say the laws has something to do with it, even if he was born into it? But there were laws that were passed before he was even born.
Well, it was there when he popped up.
Yeah.
Right? So they can't argue we did this educational system just
specifically for you.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And we're in the same boat. We both have gone to schools.
Yeah.
But they were there, right? And
But they had to be established, though.
Well, sure, for them to be there.
Yeah.
But the question is, how responsible are we for educating you particularly? It was for the general population. We support our local public schools because we think our city will be a better place if people are educated. But then we can't say to Johnny or Susie, you owe us big time because you got an education through our laws, right? Because it wasn't done for them particularly. Johnny and Susie weren't there, then we'd still have the education system.
But if I want to stay there a little bit, but also you cannot argue that the number one reason that the education was there is because for the general population to be educated, which you and I, we are part of that, right? So Socrates cannot, he was part of that general population of Athenians.
Sure, but they didn't make that for him.
Okay, so you argue
School system here.
is there for everybody.
Right, since we're here, I went to school here.
Yeah.
Yeah, from kindergarten through high school, and then I fled the city. And by the way, very happy to be back, not least for having had a chance to meet you. And so, there were schools in Mason City, 1870s, 1880s. So they were a going concern when I show up and my sister.
Yeah.
The city didn't make Harding, which is where I went to school, didn't make that school for me. It was there. Move forward to the present. A fair number of people are homeschooling now. And you could have homeschooled then. Nobody thought of it particularly. But you could have. And so, yeah, you've got a school system. Yeah, I opted to do that, but I didn't have to go to the school system. So what's the big deal about you did it and not me or my parents? So I don't think that's a great argument, right? And that argument is wrapped in a bigger argument that's been going on since then. It's the concept of implied consent.
Ooh, yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah, so let's go back to the original court decision on implied consent. It goes back to English common law, probably in the 12 or 1300s. Okay, so this is long-standing, but here's the iconic case that if you read law books, you'll read. There's this man has this cottage, and somebody knocks on the door, and he opens it, and it's 2 or 3 guys, and they say, we're here to rethatch your roof, right, which is a tough job and takes a while. And the guy says, all right, close the door. And they get up and they thatch the roof. Whenever they're finished, they come to the guy, well, here's how much it's going to cost you. And the guy says, well, I never asked you to come here and thatch the roof. You just came and said you were going to do it. It's not my problem.
Yeah.
Well, the court ruled against him on the grounds that
He knew it.
he knew that they were going to thatch the roof. He knew that he didn't ask them, and he didn't then tell them that he hadn't asked them, and they don't have to do it. So he ended up having to pay them. And notice about that case, it's about one very specific thing. It's thatching the roof. So his argument that it was implied consent for that is no good because he knew what they were going to do and didn't tell them or didn't try to stop them.
Yeah.
So for that one very narrow issue, you can argue implied consent. But the case we have of a citizen in a city who's born into a going concern, just because I use the sidewalk, that's not implied consent for anything the city wants to do. Way too broad.
Yeah.
Right? The only thing they could maybe talk to me about is, you didn't help pay for the sidewalk. And my response would be, but the sidewalk's already paid for, so why are you charging me again? So implied consent isn't an argument for obeying all of the laws.
Would it be for the specific laws? You're driving on a highway every day.
Well, here's the problem, though. Out of all of those things that go on in a city that are services or goods, and the city always has some hand in doing this because they've created the environment.
Yeah.
So to come back and say, for that one particular thing, I'm saying you gave implied consent. Well, how do you know it wasn't implied consent to walk on the sidewalks? In fact, why was it any implied consent? So this implied consent argument is really weak.
Is that what you think Socrates was using here?
Well, that's what he's arguing. Because, you never left the city unless you were on a military expedition.
We educate you.
We educate. So because of that, You've
You owe us.
implied consent to every law and everything that happens to you in the city. And that violates the whole idea of implied consent. Now, I don't know if Athenian law even recognized a thing called implied consent, but the description fits, because they're not going to argue that, look, here, we've got a parchment with your name on it, Socrates, that says you agreed to obey all the laws.
Yeah, he listed a lot of things that normal thing any citizen gain by living in the city.
Right.
He listed those as the implied, almost like what you say, is implied consent.
Yeah, that's what he's aiming at,
Yeah.
whether he uses a word or not. And we've already talked about implied consents for very narrow things and very clearly defined things, and he's using it in a broad, undefined sense.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's a good argument. So why would he include an argument like that that doesn't work?
To make us think.
To make us find that there's a mistake in the argument and thus improve our thinking and maybe get us to thinking more, right?
Okay.
So one of the more things we could think about in this situation is, Socrates has characterized the laws of the city as being able to talk to him and telling him what he was going to do was unjust. But Socrates didn't have any argument with the laws of the city. It wasn't the laws of the city that ended up putting him in jail, right?
Yeah.
It was what?
Majority of the people.
Yeah, it was the jury.
The jury, yeah.
Right. So his argument, that Crito makes it for him, is it was an unjust decision. And let's come to modern times again. I think it was Martin Luther King said, an unjust law isn't a law, right? And we say that, and we agree with that.
Oh, so you think that's where Crito was going?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what he was saying. And there's another little catch to that. If you remember in the Apology, and that's the trick about reading Plato, you got to remember things that happen in all the dialogues. It's hard. So, but you remember, he says at one point, if our laws were more like most other Greek cities, which gives more time to a capital trial than 1 day. In Athens' law is 1 day. If I had more days, I could convince you of my innocence. Now think about that. So the laws of Athens actually hurt him.
If we had more time.
If he'd had more time, and if the Athenians had made that law, he said, I would have a good chance of convincing all of you. But the Athenian laws didn't give him that.
So now Crito's making an argument that your trial was unjust, so the outcome is unjust. So escaping from prison would be just?
Well, I mean, that's a typical argument. If they throw us in jail for doing this podcast, we're going to say, unjust, unfair, wrong. If we can get out of here, we're going to get out,
we'll
right?
do that, yeah.
We'll do that. Socrates, and I think he gets Crito to agree with this, early in the dialogue, Socrates says it's never correct to do an injustice to anybody. And he further says, and it doesn't matter what they've done to you. Just because they've treated you unjustly doesn't mean that you treat them unjustly. So in fleeing the jail, who would he be doing an injustice to?
Athenians. The Athenian juries would send him to jail.
Yeah, but he hasn't done anything to any citizen if he just leaves, right?
That's true.
And he hasn't hurt the Athenian laws. They're still the same.
He broke them by fleeing.
Is that an injustice to the city? To the laws in particular?
Yeah.
Why?
Breaking the law is unjust.
That's correct. But to whom?
To the city of Athens.
Okay, let's talk for a second about what he thinks injustice is.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, well, these are endless, and we love it. So Socrates thinks when you do injustice to someone, the reason it's always wrong is you're harming their soul. And that's the most valuable part of any of us.
Yeah.
Now, does Athens have a soul?
The city?
Yeah.
No, I mean, in that context, no, the city don't have a soul in it.
No, it's just a name of a collective.
Yeah.
And collectives don't have souls.
But what is Athens?
It's
the city
it's
that have people in it, right?
It's a name of the collective,
Okay.
right? And collectives don't have individual souls because the title also implies all of the regime issues, right?
Yeah.
Like the courts and the schools and gymnasia and all that stuff. A lot of those things as individuals don't have souls, and particularly the collective doesn't have a soul, even though souls live in the city. So if you say you left Mason City and went to Philadelphia for a few days, he said, I left Mason City. That is about the name of the whole place, right? Mm-hmm. And yes, that also implies that you left all of us in the city.
Yeah.
But you also left the buildings and the government and all of that. And so collectively, we can't have a soul. And that's generally true. And so if injustice is hurting a soul, and a city doesn't have a soul, or more particularly, the laws of a city certainly don't have a soul. You can agree with that, readily.
Yep.
So how's he doing an injustice?
Interesting.
For example, when you get news of the fact that you've been charged with a crime, and an indictment is there, it takes a couple weeks from that point till you're called into the office of the Archon Basileus to work out exactly how the charge is going to be phrased and what the issues are. Not infrequently, people recognizing after they get the indictment and sort of assessing their chance of defending themselves decide to just leave. Right? Mm-hmm. Is that an injustice to Athens?
But would it be injustice to his accuser?
Why? Did he hurt his accuser's soul?
Yeah, because they did not see justice being served for Socrates skipping the town.
Let's say it was Socrates that skipped town. And I think that's what Crito's referring to when he said, well, your friends didn't help you. They could have arranged that right away, right?
Oh, before even the trial started.
Before the trial started.
Okay.
And so would you say that Miletus and Lycon and Anytus were treated unjustly? Well, they wanted to get rid of Socrates. They did. He's gone. He can't come back.
So is that what he was talking about when he say he was ashamed, Crito, about how the trial and everything turned out?
Yes. We should have done this before the trial.
Okay, because that was my other question. I did not know what he was talking about when he said those words.
Yeah, I think that's what he was referring to. Because, the same guys with the same amount of money and without having to spend any money on bribing a bunch of people could have just hustled him and his family out of town. And they had several options for him.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, that Crito's feeling was shame, right? Because remember back to Protagoras when we were talking about political virtues, the first two things that Zeus wanted Hermes to give to all humans was justice, because that's the essential thing for them to form a society that can get along. But included in that, but not a separate virtue, was shame. Mm-hmm. And remember, shame is the recognition of the unwritten laws and customs and mores of the city. Yeah. So if you don't hold the door open for somebody, that's not a crime. They're not going to take you to court. But it's a violation of mores, customs. So shame is an important thing. So Crito's saying, I'm ashamed because I feel like even though I may not be breaking the law, I am going against the custom of the Athenians. If I don't help you, and if your other friends don't help you, we all feel ashamed because it's the duty of a friend to help a friend. In fact, that's close to being a definition of justice, but not quite. So Socrates is not buying any of this.
No. And I don't know why. I felt like Crito was a shrewd businessman.
He was very good. He got wealthy in agriculture,
Okay.
which was not the easiest thing to get wealthy in.
He said something there, and I think I know what that was. I want to confirm. So, right in the beginning, when Socrates was asking Crito, I'm surprised the guard let you in. Mm-hmm. And he said, he's quite friendly to me by now, Socrates. I have been here often, and I have given him something. Is he talking about bribe?
A lot of commentators think that's true, but it isn't necessarily true. Jailers were, it's not a high income way to make a living, okay? And, it's tough. It could have been something as simple as, he brought him a little extra food without intention to influence him in any way. Now, when it comes time for Socrates to escape, that's going to cost him.
Because I was thinking the businessman who was willing to break the law to break his friends out of prison, he would not hesitate to bribe the guard.
Well, when the time came, I'm sure he would. And maybe he had already by then. Crito gets there very early, and the jailer's nice enough to open the door early. And then when he goes into Socrates' cell,
he just sit tight.
He just sits and watches him sleep. Mm-hmm. And he's thinking to himself, what an amazing guy this is, that he's going to die. And
in here.
Crito thinks it's going to be the same day. But he's going to die within a very short time, and he's sleeping like a baby. And I've spent all night worrying about him, and if I was in the same position, I'd be panicky probably, or at least greatly disturbed, as I think most of us would. And here's Socrates just sleeping away, but it's a touching scene between two old friends, and shows you what kind of a man Crito was.
When Socrates woke up, he was asking Crito, how long you been here?
Yep.
Why you did not wake me up? And then later in the dialogue, Socrates mentioned something about the dream he had through that time that Crito was there. And he just used that dream to talk to Crito about the conversation they had. And I was like, that's interesting. You wanted a man to wake you up, and now here you had this dream that you're using on your dialogue. And I cannot remember exactly what the dream was about.
I'll tell you.
Oh, there we go. That's why I got you here.
That's why I'm here, right? So his dream was that a beautiful woman dressed in white came to him in his dream and said, you shall be in Phthia 3 days from now. And then she's gone. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, that's a line from the Iliad, that Bible of the Greeks.
Oh, that's what it is, the Bible of the Greeks? Kind of?
Yeah, the Iliad and the Odyssey were, and Hesiod's Birth of the Gods were the main books. But everybody knew the Iliad inside and out and the Odyssey inside and out. So the original lines were spoken by Achilles. Now, it's interesting. People say, well, maybe he's comparing himself with Achilles. I don't think so in this case. But the words are appropriate because Socrates interprets the words to mean that Phthia is wherever you go after you die, and that he thinks he won't have to drink the hemlock for a couple more days. Right? And so that's, as you say, it's a good thing that Crito didn't wake him up, because then he wouldn't have known that.
He said, it would not be fitting at my age to resent the fact that I must die now.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I'm actually quite a bit older than Socrates. It does begin to dawn on you that there's only going to be so many birthdays. I'm 78, just to make it clear. So at some point, you're going to check out, and there's really nothing you can do about it much. Try to keep your health. But regardless, things happen. I know a couple of weeks ago, my last remaining uncle died.
Oh.
He was 92, and it was a freak thing. His wife, Aunt Phyllis, had walked down a hallway, and he was in a wheelchair, and he tried to get up from the wheelchair to follow, and he fell straight forward and didn't get his hands out.
Ooh.
Yeah, so hit his head real hard on the floor, and that was it. So, you begin to think about those kind of things as the years go by. you have to deal with that. And Socrates dealt with that perfectly, in my opinion. But he recognized 70 was a ripe old age. Not that some people didn't live beyond that, but he knew he wasn't going to have too many more birthdays.
And plus, he lived a good life.
Great life.
Crito responded to him and said, well, other men of your age are caught in such misfortunes, but their age does not prevent them resenting their fate.
Yeah, and if you think back to the Republic, in the first book there, they go to the house of Cephalus, and he's an old man. And so they sit and talk, and Socrates asks him, what's it like at your time of life? And they have a fairly long conversation about that, during which Cephalus says, when you get to be my age, the things that you didn't think much about, like what the afterlife would be like, good or bad, didn't concern you much because that's always seen as something a long ways off, and so why trouble yourself with it? But at our age, me and my friends, we sometimes wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, wondering what's going to happen. And that's when they get started to talking about what's the value of money, and then into the question of justice. But he gives a very nice description of old men getting panicky about death because who knows what good or bad things might happen to you. They choose the bad. I mean, you think about the bad ones more, I think.
Yeah.
Now, this is the third in the typical series of dialogues that are put together under the name The Death of Socrates. So it starts out with Euthyphro. That's a question about piety. And the reason it's lumped with the other three is it happens a few days before the trial.
Yeah.
Remember, they meet in front of the Archon Basileus' office, and Socrates is explaining how he's been indicted and so on. So that fits. And then there's the trial, the apology of Socrates, then the Crito, and then there's one more dialogue, the Phaedo. That's the last day of Socrates. That's the day he drinks the hemlock at the end of the day. And Crito's there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Would you get out of prison?
Well, as we've talked before, it wouldn't have been such a long conversation with Crito. Crito, why are we sitting around here talking? Let's get a move on.
You got the car outside and you took care of the guard?
That's right.
What are we waiting for?
That's exactly right.
Another thing they talk about in there, the social tyranny. A little bit, the majority and the minority.
Yeah.
Is that where Mill picked that from?
I wouldn't be surprised. He was very familiar with this stuff. It's the point is, Socrates says you shouldn't care about what the opinion of the masses is. Majority opinion doesn't matter. They may not have any access to the truth, and so there's nothing they can do to you.
Yeah.
And Crito rightly says, but Socrates, it was the mass of those people that got you into the jail right here. And that's when Socrates, and he says this a number of places, you don't find truth by voting. And that's interesting because our whole political system is based on finding some kind of truth by voting.
Is it?
Sure.
Or it's just voting for the sake of voting? Do we really vote for the finding the truth?
In a policy sense, I think that's at least part of it. But you're right. It's sometimes we vote for personality or out of party loyalty or ideological loyalty. But we do like to think that the vote that we cast will somehow lead to policies that we would support either out of self-interest or interest for our whole society. So there's an attempt to find some truth. And besides, we can be critical of democracy for that, and Plato occasionally is. Think about any other form of government, even if you're not voting and you're ruled by an oligarchy or a monarch, the policies may accidentally favor you or accidentally hurt you. It's not too much different in a democracy because you vote what you think is best, and you may win, or at least you may get the person elected, or you may not. And if you don't, maybe the person on the other side, let's say, they're going to support policies that you don't support. But there's no guarantee that if the person you voted for is elected,
Will support
that
your
they
policy.
will support them. And that's a problem much considered publicly today.
Yeah. Here's what Socrates say. We should not then think so much of what the majority will say about us, but what he will say who understands justice and injustice, the one that is and the truth itself.
And then you got to put beside that Socrates' continued assertion that nobody knows what's just and right. That's divine wisdom, and we don't have it. That's one of the more troubling puzzles in the dialogues.
Do you think Socrates was blindly following Athenians' law here?
It's hard to imagine him blindly following anything. But we've talked about and considered the possibility, at least, that the reasons he was giving weren't valid. Now, does that mean he had some other reasons? There are people who have looked at his trial and this dialogue and the dialogue of his last day and said, well, really what was going on here, Socrates finding himself older and getting feeble, was basically committing suicide by jury. And so they argue that his defense in the apology was not good at all. I totally disagree with that, but they argue that. And therefore, he wanted the jury to find him guilty. His interesting counter suggestion for a penalty.
That will make a lot of sense.
It has plausibility, right?
Yeah.
But he certainly doesn't argue to Crito, look, I'm old and feeble and I can hardly stand this stuff anymore. I'm just going to check out and, hand me the hemlock as soon as you can. And that's one pole of the arguments. The other was, it really was an unjust decision. His defense was really quite good. And had he had more time, he might well have changed the vote enough to have him acquitted. But I don't see this argument ever being resolved.
I'm leaning toward the suicide by the jury argument.
Well, as I said, it's plausible. Not a lot of people live to his age. I mean, I would say it's probably his 70 is our 85 or 90.
Oh, wow. But he gave us something to process for the rest of our life, generation after generation. So,
Yep.
what's the lesson in this dialogue?
Well, this dialogue started an immensely long conversation among political theorists. And it goes generally by the name is, do you have a duty to obey the law? Oof. Yeah, and great stuff has been written about it. You and I have encountered the social contract theorists who have a view of that. But there are lots of other writers who have addressed that. I think it'll always be an object of contention, right?
Is it the question should be, do you have the duty to obey all the laws?
That's what the question is, yes, all the laws. Now, we've encountered in our lifetime, it's before you. Martin Luther King was before you. Yeah. He's the last significant believer in civil disobedience, which is to say the laws have to be disobeyed because the laws are unjust.
Yeah.
I don't have a duty to obey unjust laws, so get things fixed up. His efforts brought forth a lot of important things in our country. But there are others. Henry David Thoreau wrote a good book on civil disobedience.
Yep.
That's a great one. Gandhi in India was a great advocate of civil disobedience. I think he had read Thoreau. There have been others.
I read somewhere they say only Jesus and Socrates, they had the biggest impact in the world.
At least in Western civilization. I think that's true. I tend to give more credit to Socrates because he was a human being. I'm not diminishing Christ's impact, but he, after all, is God.
That's true.
But then Christ had a shorter period to take that into account.
Who else in the world, Professor, that we're still reading 2,500 years later?
There are some. Certainly Homer, the great poet of the ancient Greeks. Homer and Iliad is taught in literature courses, but it's been read constantly
Okay.
across the Western world since then. There are some Roman thinkers. Cicero comes to mind. You know, you can say there's 40 books that are still read from the ancient world.
Okay.
Those are the most influential. And I'm not counting the Bible in that for the reason we just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the Bible's the most read book in the world, I think.
Anything else, Professor, you want to add to Crito?
I think we did a fair job of covering it.
I think so. All right, Professor.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you for time and effort and equipment.
Not a problem.